as part of showcasing his religion to Oxford University Union as the best and the only one that suits the 21st century. Dr. Zakir Naik talked about the scientific truths that are supposed to have been spoken by his God 1400 years back. Let us see the fifth scientific truth that was highlighted by Dr. Naik.
Previously we thought that the light of the moon was its own light. Recently we have come to know that the light of the moon is not its own light, but it is a reflected and borrowed light. The Qur'an says in Surah Furqan, chapter number 25, verse number 61, "Blessed is he who has placed the constellation in the sky and placed therein sun, a lamp having its own light, and moon having borrowed or reflected light." So the Qur'an describes the moonlight as borrowed or reflected, which we came to know recently in science.
As if the point is clear to the audience, he does not go into the details, just makes the routine tall claim that this truth was known to the scientists just recently. Now let us see what actually is mentioned in the quoted verse. Blessed is he who made constellation in the skies and placed therein a lamp and moon giving light. While the verse clearly says that the moon giving light, Dr. Naik has intentionally misinterpreted it as moon's borrowed light or reflected light, to claim it as another instance of scientific principle mentioned in Qur'an 1400 years back, but was found by scientists just a few decades back. Others have to blame themselves for not having a grip on English language, like Dr. Naik has, for not understanding even simple words like moon giving light actually means moon's borrowed or reflected light. Blame again goes to them only for not having a pair of keen eyes like the one Dr. Naik has, for not able to see a great scientific truth in such a silly scientific blunder that the Quran has. Or is it because of Dr. Naik's too much obsession with Allah and Quran that makes him only to read what he wanted in such simple English words? Being a medical doctor, he must be knowing that this symptom called grandiose is associated with a mental issue called delusional disorder requiring urgent medical intervention. Nevertheless, this verse again shows up another scientific blunder in Quran. Now let us see the sixth scientific principle showcased by Dr. Naik from Quran.
When I was in school, I passed my school in 1982, about 29 years back. There I had learned in science that the sun, though it revolves, it does not rotate about its own axis. But the Quran mentions in Surah Anbiya, chapter number 21, verse number 33, "Huwa allazi khalaqal layla wan nahara." It is he who has created the night and the day. "Washamsa wal qamar," the sun and the moon. "Kullun fi falaki yasbahun," each one traveling in orbit with its own motion. The Quran says the sun and the moon, besides revolving, it also rotates about its own axis. And today, recently, a few decades earlier, science has come to know that the sun rotates and takes about 25 days to complete one rotation, which has been incorporated in most of the school textbooks throughout the world.
Now let us see what actually is mentioned in that verse. It is who created the night and day, and the sun and the moon, all the celestial bodies, swim along, each in its rounded course. Here the phrase swim along, each in its rounded course, is taken for granted by Dr. Naik to showcase that it means the scientific truth of sun rotating on its own axis. Again, the Arabic linguistic expert in Dr. Naik has created a new meaning for the phrase swim along, to interpret it as rotation on its own axis by the sun. Then Dr. Naik trumpets it as a scientific truth discovered only after he passed his school in 1982. As mentioned earlier, there appears to be some pathological problem that affects Dr. Naik's comprehension of English language. That problem perhaps make him interpret Quran the way it suits his objectives. That his interpretations are preconceived will ulterior motives becomes clear when we read the same scientific Quran as verses that describe sunset as when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it set in a spring of murky water. For Quran, the sunset is sun setting in a spring of murky water. It is a different matter. The scientific blunder in Quran may be brushed aside by Dr. Naik as a poetical expression only. But this is the same Dr. Naik who interpreted a poetical expression, swim along, as sun rotating in its own axis, and claimed it as a scientific truth known to his God 1400 years back. Thus, it becomes another instance of poetical expressions interpreted to suit the objective. What you call such a person? Devil quoting scriptures? Now let us see the 8th scientific truth that Dr. Zakir Naik showcased.
There may be certain skeptics who will say, it's nothing great that the Quran speaks about astronomy since the Arabs were advanced in the field of astronomy. But I'd like to remind them that the Arabs became advanced in the field of astronomy a few hundred years after the Quran was revealed. So it is from the Quran that the Arabs learned about astronomy and not the vice versa.
Here Dr. Naik deliberately hides the historical fact that it was the fallout of the military invasions by the Arabs to spread Islam into India that created opening for scientific advancement, that fueled the golden age of Islamic scholarship between the 9th and 12th century in places like Baghdad, Damascus and Cairo. It is important to note that Indian Aryabhata way back in 499 AD correctly demonstrated that the earth rotates about its axis daily and that the apparent movement of the stars is a relative motion caused by the rotation of the earth, contrary to the then prevailing view that the sky rotated. Aryabhata's work was of great influence in the astronomical traditions and influenced several neighboring cultures through translations. The Arabic translation during the Islamic Golden Age 820 AD was particularly influential. Calendrical calculations derived by Aryabhata and his followers have been in continuous use not only in India but in the Islamic countries, forming the base for national calendars in use in Iran and Afghanistan even today. Thus, all the scientific advancement of the Arabs were despite the Quran having scientific blunders, reading of which even a primary students will be ashamed. Let us see the 9th scientific principle that Dr. Zakir Naik showcased out of Quran.
In the field of hydrology, we learn in the school about the water cycle. How does the water evaporates from the ocean, forms into clouds, moves into interior, falls down as rain, and the water table is replenished. This was first described by Sir Bernard Palissy in the year 1580. The Quran too describes the water cycle in great detail 1400 years ago. The Quran says the water evaporates from the ocean, forms into clouds, the clouds join, they move into the interior, they fall down as rain, and the water table is replenished and the water cycle is completed. The Quran speaks about the water cycle in great detail in several places. In Surah Az-Zumur, chapter number 39, verse number 21. In Surah Rum, chapter number 30, verse number 24. In Surah Mu'minun, chapter number 23, verse number 18. In Surah Hijr, chapter number 15, verse number 22.
Now let us see what is actually mentioned in one of the verses that he quoted. Now let us see what is mentioned in the second verse that Dr. Naik quoted. Now just to confirm the many of the scientific revelations on water cycles in Quran that Dr. Naik eloquently quoted, let us hear him once again.
The Quran says the water evaporates from the ocean, forms into clouds, the clouds join, they move into the interior, they fall down as rain, and the water table.
Now go back to the surahs and see whether anywhere Allah talked about the water evaporation from the earth, cloud formation, etc. In both the places, Dr. Naik's God simply talks about sending water from the sky. Even if you check all the verses quoted by Naik, you are not going to find information other than this. It is shocking, isn't it? Contrary to Dr. Naik's tall claims, Allah's knowledge was limited to what is generally observed by any primary class student. He was ignorant about the water cycle that Dr. Naik learned from his English medium school and reproduced here as if it is mentioned in several places in Quran. What you call this type of interpretation? Blasphemy for putting words into God's mouth and claim it as a scientific truth in Quran. Now let us see the 10th scientific truth Dr. Naik has showcased from the Quran.
In the field of biology, the Quran says in Surah Anbiya, chapter number 21, verse number 30, that we have created every living thing from water. Will you not then believe? Imagine in the deserts of Arabia, the Quran says every living thing is made from water. Who could have believed in it? Today, after science advanced, we have come to know that every living being, it contains cells. And the basic substance of cell is the cytoplasm, which contains about 80% water. Today, science tells us that every living creature contains 50 to 90% water.
We made from water every living thing. Now the same Quran in some other places says that man is made out of clay. Obviously, Dr. Naik's God has two different opinions on creation. It is clear from these verses. In one place he says that it is out of water and another place it is out of clay. When there are two opinions about creation, which one has to be believed, since both statements cannot be true? Thus, these two statements on creation become one of the thousands of glaring inconsistencies that Quran has. And it is this book that is marketed as final message from God for the whole humanity till the day of judgment. In any case, the scientific discovery that living beings contain 80% water cannot be the final act behind creation. The remaining 20% must be the critical factor, as no human baby has so far emerged out of water kept for that purpose in the laboratories. Surprisingly, in both the places, the last and the final word of God is not only silent about this, but comes nowhere near to any likely factors. But with Dr. Zakir Naik and his research team around, nothing can be ruled out in near future. Out of nowhere, they may dig out some cure words out of Quran, even as the scientist painstakingly discovers the principles behind creation. And then again, it would be trumpeted as the scientific principle already mentioned in Quran 1400 years ago. But surprisingly, one question arises: why none of the research teams of Allah on earth are coming out of new discoveries as Quran as the basis? Again, why do they only revel at showing all the discovered things as already there in Quran? Waiting as they are for the Quran promised awards of paradise, they may be disinterested in petty earthly awards like the Nobel Prize.